This week's demo lab is also focused on confidence intervals, but we're going to be breaking them down by category or group and then comparing them. So you want to open up this week 6 DL document. And the first part, we're not actually going to use SPSS. So we're going to find a scientific poll online, just like last week. And this time, though, instead of just finding one response, like the percent that agree or something like that, you're going to either look at two different responses. So like the percent that agree versus disagree, or you're going to look at two different groups. So like here's the percent of women that agree compared to percent of men that agree. So I'm going to go to week 5. And there's a bunch of links here. Let's start with Pew. And I'm going to find one that I want to look at. Okay, and so here's my URL for the poll. Then it says to share a screenshot of results and the margin of error. So I'm looking and they're comparing Harris and Trump supporters. There's a bunch of different questions here comparing, for example, how people feel about whether religion should be kept separate from government policies. I'm just going to choose what I want. Why don't I look at the Social Security one to see how different these are or not. I'll do the one above it too, just to show you kind of two comparisons. So here's my poll results. And then I need margins of error. Oh, I should also make sure I know. I'm going to do the whole thing because I want to know which are Harris and Trump supporters. I mean, blue is for Democrat, red is for Republican, but let's not. Okay, so now I need to find my margin of error. You can see it's not on the first page. Usually it's near the end. Here's weighting. Here we go. So let me just copy this image and paste it in here. And my margin of error, though, here is not 1.9%, right? This is comparing Harris supporters and Trump supporters. And so I'm looking for those two lines. It says there's a half form. So there might be some questions where people only got some questions right and only half the people got that. And so that would increase with a smaller sample size, that would increase your margin of error. But I don't see anything about the questions we're looking at that indicate that these were half form questions. So I'm just going to use the full form for it based on registered voters. Yep. Okay. So the next thing is to make a confidence interval. So I'm looking again at, let's see the Social Security one. I had Trump supporters at 77% and Harris supporters at 83%. And then we'll also just look at this government aid to the poor does more harm than good. And it was Trump at 72, Harris 18. So those are my sample proportions. And then I also need my margins of error. So for Harris, it was 2.6%, and for Trump, it was 2.8%. Okay. So for Social Security, to make my confidence interval, I'm going to take my sample proportion and I'm going to add and subtract my margin of error. So for Trump, it was 77%, and the margin of error was 2.8%. And so my confidence interval is 74.2% to 79.8%. And for Harris, my proportion was 83%, and my margin of error was 2.6%. So I'm going to do 83% minus 2.6% and 83% plus 2.6%. Oops. Okay. And then again, if I'm doing this for this other one, let's see, the same thing. My margins of error are the same for these, but my sample proportions are different. So Trump is going to be 72% plus or minus 2.8%. For Harris supporters, it was 18% minus 2.6% equals 15.4% and 20.6%. Okay. So now I'm going to explain these in a real life context. So for the Social Security one, we could say that we are, for all of these, we're going to say we're 95% confident that, and so for Social Security, it's somewhere between 74.2% and 79.8%. So that's my lower and upper bound of Trump supporters feel that Social Security should not be reduced in any way. So again, in the sample, we know 77% of the people that answered the poll that are Trump supporters felt that way. But if we're generalizing out to all Trump supporters during this time period, it would be this. And then the Harris one is going to look exactly the same, except it's going to be Harris supporters, and it's going to be our lower and upper bound for them. And so we end up saying that we're 95% confident that somewhere between 80.4% and 85.6% of Harris supporters feel that Social Security should not be reduced in any way. All right, let's look at the other poll question here. So for that, it's again 95% confident. That's the margin of error we used. And for Trump supporters, it's between 69.2% and 74.8%. Feel that government aid does to the poor does more harm than good. And Harris, it would be 15.4 and 20.6. Okay. How close might these be? So for Social Security, if we take these confidence intervals, I'm just going to do that today. Okay, for Social Security, these were my Trump supporting one and Harris supporting one. And so you can, again, if you have trouble with this, I would suggest just drawing it out kind of on a number line and seeing where they fall. And so we can see that the closest they might be is here, right? This is the closest they might be. If these overlapped, then they could be the same. So like if the upper bound here was 82, and then they could both be 82%, for example. So I'd actually say that they could be 0% apart, right? They could be the same. But here, right, these don't overlap. They're different, but they could be pretty close. So we can look at the upper bound and lower bound here are the closest. And if I find the difference between them, I'm just subtracting to see. And they are 0.6% different. So this is the closest that they could be at 95% confidence. And then the furthest, again, if you picture on these a number line, this is lower, this is higher. And so the furthest would be the lower bound for Trump supporters and the upper bound for Harris supporters. Okay. If we looked at the other one of government aid does more to the poor does more harm or good. Um, you can see this time the Harris one is to the left of the Trump one, right? And so if we look, how close could they be? So the closest would be if this one was as high as it could be and this was as low as it could be. So closest would be at the 95% confidence level, 69.2 minus 20.6 equals 48.6%. And the furthest would be, right, if this was the lowest and this was the highest, that would be the furthest they might be away at that. So 59.4%. Um, so are these proportions significantly different from one another at the 95% confidence level? So for both of these, the answer is yes, right? Because our confidence intervals don't overlap. So we're 95% confident that that at most 79.8% of Trump supporters say that we shouldn't change Social Security, and at least 80.4% of Harris supporters feel that way. So they don't overlap, right? And so, right, the closest, does not include zero, right? They don't overlap. And so that means they're significantly different, meaning we're over 95% confident they're not the same, right? And for this one, again, we can tell that they are significantly different because there's this big gap here, right? Almost 50% of this gap between the two. These two confidence intervals don't overlap. So yes, the confidence intervals don't overlap. Okay, when we're looking at the 95% confidence intervals, right, they're not overlapping. If they did overlap, then we'd say, right, that they're not significantly different. We can't be confident at the 95% confidence interval that they're different. What does it mean in real life context? So we are over 95% confident that, and here we're talking about all Trump supporters and Harris supporters, not just the ones in the sample, right? That Harris and Trump supporters see a different proportion of Harris and Trump supporters feel that Social Security should not be reduced in any way. And likewise, right, that government aid to the poor does more harm than good. So we know from this, right, significant means, right, that these are different. We're confident the percentages are different. We can actually tell the direction from our analysis here, right? We can see that we're confident that a higher proportion of Harris supporters than Trump supporters think Social Security should not be changed, and that a higher percentage of Trump supporters than Harris supporters think that government aid to the poor does more harm than good. Are they substantively different from one another at the 95% confidence level? So if we go back to looking at how different they might be at the confidence level, so they both could be substantive, right? Like for Social Security, we're seeing they could be 11.4% apart. So that's over 1 out of every 10 additional Trump supporter thinking that, Harris supporter thinking that we shouldn't change Social Security comparatively, but we're not 95% confident about that, right? We're 95% confident they're at least 0.6% apart. So I would say that's not that substantive. That's almost the same. And so I would say, right, that like these two are not substantively different at the 95% confidence level. They might just be 0.6% apart. If it's at least 5% or more, I'm going to generally say that it is substantively different. 5% might not seem like a lot, but that's 1 out of every 20 people. And if you think about the millions of Trump and Harris supporters in our country, that's a lot of people when you look at 5% of it. But 0.6% to me seems not that substantively different. For this one, however, we're confident at the 95% they're at least 48.6% different. That's a lot. So for this one, I would say yes, they are at least 48.6% different. right? So there's at least 48.6% more Harris supporters compared to Trump supporters who think that, Trump supporters compared to Harris supporters who think that government aid to the poor does more harm than good. So what does this mean? So for the first one, we are not over 95% confident that the difference between Harris and Trump supporters in terms of feelings that about whether Social Security should be reduced in any way are sizably different, right? Are meaningfully different in scale and scope, are substantively different. So again, we were confident that they were different, right? But we're only confident they're at least 0.6% different. So they could be substantively different, but we're not 95% confident that they are. And then for the other one, it means we are over 95% confident that the difference between Harris and Trump supporters in terms of feelings about whether government aid to the poor does more harm than good are substantively different, right? Or sizably different. But the difference is a meaningful and substantive size. Okay. Before we move on, that one compared two groups. I just want to show you one other. Let's go to Monmouth polls. And I'll just look at this first one, drop-in support for Swifties GOTV. So this poll of US voters is about how many approve of Swift encouraging her fans to vote. And so we can see here that instead of comparing like Harris and Trump supporters, here I'm just taking all US voters, the sample of them. And for example, I can compare the percent that said they approve versus they don't approve. So I would take a screenshot of this, right? This would be my question I'm looking at. And then my margin of error is just 3.9%. It's not the subgroups. Here's subgroups. Again, like if I had when I was looking at for, let's see, like if I wanted to with this poll, if they have it, yeah, I could go and I could see, do you approve or disapprove? So I could compare Republicans to Democrats. I could compare men to women, right? I could compare liberals to conservatives. And if I did that kind of thing, I'm going to need to use some of these margins of errors, kind of like we did last time of the subgroups. But for all registered voters, I'm using this 3.9 because I'm just going to compare the September findings here. And I'm going to look at the margin of error. So I take the 53% and I'd add or subtract my margin of error of 3.9%. And then I do the same thing for that 35%. And so then I'd say, okay, I'm 95% confident that somewhere I'm going to estimate this to like 4% instead, just for the sake of this, somewhere between about 49% and 57% of US voters in September 2024 would approve of Taylor Swift encouraging her fans to vote in the upcoming presidential election. And somewhere between 31 and 39% of US registered voters would disapprove of the same. So then if I'm comparing it, I'm saying, okay, do these overlap, these confidence intervals? Well, this one is at most 39 and this one is at least 49. And so they don't overlap. So they're significantly different. And then we can see that's at least a 10% gap. And so they're also substantively different. So I'm over 95% confident both that there's a difference among US registered voters in terms of approving versus disapproving, right? And I'm also over 95% confident that that's a sizable difference, right? We're 95% confident that there's at least a 10% difference among registered voters in September 2024 between those that approve and those that disapprove. Okay. Let's look at part 2. So for this one, you're going to open up the same codebook and data set as last week. So we're using General Social Survey 2022, which is of US adults, a representative sample. And we're going to have a new syntax file to open. Okay, so here's my syntax file. And I have my data set open. And I have my code book open. Okay. All right. So I open these all up. So I'm done with this one. So I'm going to make sure that my output will display my syntax commands in the log, turn on waiting, and then I'm going to do a confidence interval of theism just like last time, but broken down by that variable. I did the indicator variable confidence interval at the end of last week, which was mental health indicator, okay? A dichotomous one where it's just 0 or 1. So I remember that my weight variable name is just weight variable, and my primary variable name is theism. And then the one I'm going to break it down by is the mental health indicator. Okay, I want to make sure I'm using the indicator version of this that's just 0 and 1 because I don't want confidence intervals for 0, 1, 2, 3, 0 through 30, right? That's just too many. I just want to compare the indicator of the people who said they had 0 days of poor mental health in the past 30 days to people who said they had at least 1. So 1 to 30 days of poor mental health. So I will run this. The other way I can do this again is I can go edit, options, viewer, and make sure this is checked and click OK. I can go data, weight cases, find my weight variable, click OK. And then I would go, so in the syntax it's called examine, but in dropdown it's explore, analyze, descriptives, explore. And then I'm going to put my main variable, which is theism for this, into the dependent list. That's my dependent variable. And then I'm breaking it down by this mental health indicator. And so I'm going to put that in the factor list. And you could change these things, right? Like if I don't want certain plots, or if I do want certain plots, or if I do or don't want certain statistics. But the stuff it'll give me by default is good enough for what I'm looking for right now. Okay. So it wants me to share my syntax and my output. So here is my syntax. And then this is what my output looks like. I only need the confidence intervals here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to trim this. So I double clicked on it and I'm going to get rid of some of this extra stuff that I don't want to distract me. So I'm just right clicking on the cells that I don't want, the rows, the columns I don't want, and deleting them. And then when I X out of this, it'll update it right there. So this is what I want. Okay. Take a look at the sample theism means for each category. What are the sample means? Share the values and label them. So for no days of poor mental health, the sample mean is 4.79. So you see this is just the mean, right? And then for 1 to 30 days, the sample mean is 4.34. Okay. How do they compare or contrast? So let's look at theism again so I can answer in context. So they're both between 4 and 5, but the folks with mental health are a little closer to 4, and the folks with at least 1 day, so without any mental health, poor mental health days are a little closer to 4. The folks with it are a little closer to 5. So what I will say here then is among respondents, those with no poor mental health days in the past month lean towards, well, both groups were between, on average, sorry, both groups were on average between sometimes believing in God, that's a 4, and believing in God, but with doubts. Those with no days of poor mental health, but they were a little higher, right? Were closer to believing, but with doubts, while those with at least one day of poor mental health were closer to sometimes. Okay. What are the confidence intervals for them? So here's where we can see the lower and upper bounds, and that's where I'm going to grab it from. And so for no days of poor mental health, it is 4.67 to 4.92. And for 1+ days, it is, so any number of days, it's 4.21 and 4.48. What do they mean in context? I am 95% confident that among US adults in 2022, who had no days of poor mental health in the past month, that they would be somewhere on the theism scale that goes from 1 to 6, 1 atheism, just 6 theism without doubt, between 4.67 and 4.92, which is close to believing in God with doubts. And then I'd say for the other group, right, that I am 95% confident that they would be close to, I don't say, between close to somewhat believing and, or sometimes, sorry, isn't it? Yeah, sometimes believing in God, and halfway between sometimes believing and believing with doubts. Okay, again, it's a little bit harder with a question like this to kind of define and explain and measure that. We'll look at one more example in a little bit. How close together or far apart might they be? Okay, so let's look. And I have to provide a specific number and show my calculations, or I wouldn't have calculations if they overlap for the closer one. So I'm just changing the order here because I want to look, this one's to the left of this one. And so if I'm visualizing this, right, like it's kind of like this one's going to here, and then this one, let's see, if this stops at 4.48, this one's kind of here. So you can see that they don't overlap, right? The most this is here, the least this is here. If they did overlap, let's say this one went to 5, right? Or this one went to 4.8 or something, right? Or this one started at 4 or 4.3 or something. If they overlapped, then the closest they might be is 0, right? They might be the same. But here I can see the closest they might be is if this one was up here and that one was down there. So that would be 4.67 minus 4.48, which equals 0.19. Okay. Then I want to know how far apart might they be. So when we're looking close together, we're looking, okay, right here and right here. Now we want to look how far. So that would be like here and here. So that's going to be the lower bound here and my upper bound here. That would make them as far apart as possible. Okay. Is there a significant difference? Yes, they don't overlap, right? We can tell at 95% confidence they're not the same. How do I know? The confidence intervals don't overlap. What does this mean in real life context, right? That it's significant. I am over 95% confident that the mean theistic beliefs of US adults. Again, this is my target population, not the sample, of US adults with no days of poor mental health in the past month, and US adults with at least 1 day of poor mental health the past month are different, right? That these means are not the same. If they did overlap, then I'd say no, they're not significant, and I'd say I'm not over 95% confident that they're different, right? They could be the same. We're not confident that they're different. Is there a substantive difference? So we're confident that they're at least 0.2 apart. So you're going to have to kind of decide what you think about this. If I'm looking at this is only a 5-point scale, right? It goes from 1 to 6, so there's kind of 5 hops. And so if I were to say, what is a 0.2 divided by 5, that's like a 4% difference on the whole kind of scale of how much they're moving. So it's not quite at 5%. I can also just think like, okay, where might they be? So if I'm looking at how close together it might be like this one's almost at 4.5 and this one's about at 4.7. And so I can say, yeah, I don't really think those are that different. It's not like one is believing with doubts and one is higher power, but not a god, etc. They seem kind of pretty similar qualitatively as I think about where they, the closest that they might be together. So I'm going to say that they're not substantively different. But again, this is going to be a judgment call that you justify. So I'm going to say no. I'm going to say I am only 95% confident that they are at least 0.19 units apart, which is pretty small. They are both between sometimes believing and believing with doubts. And I could just say like this doesn't seem to be substantively different in terms of their beliefs, right? They're pretty much the same there. And then what does it mean in real life context? So here I'm saying I am not over 95% confident that the means are sizably different, right? That they're different in the amount that matters. So I'm not over 95% confident are meaningfully or sizably or substantially different, right? If I was saying they were substantively different, then I would say I am over 95% confident that they are. So again, significant, we were saying it is significant. So we're saying we're not over 95% confident the means are different, but I'm saying that I'm not over 95% confident that they're substantively different, right? They could be a little more different than 0.19, right? They're at most, they could be this different, the 95% confidence level, but we're only 95% confident they're at least this different. Do you think that there's a causal relationship? So does whether somebody has had poor mental health days in the past 30 days impact or have an effect on their belief, the level of their belief in God? And so for this, I'm going to say no, because there wasn't, because I didn't have evidence, right, that they were meaningfully different anyway. If they were substantively different, then I would need to make a claim about why it's causal. So I might think about, well, why is it that the folks who have no mental health days are more theistic? So maybe folks with poor mental health days are more likely to doubt God because they're feeling like if they believed in God, God would give them better mental health or something. I don't know. But if you want to argue that it's causal, so if you have a significant and substantive difference, you want to think about what might be causing that variation, what might be going on with mental health that might cause people to have different theistic beliefs. Okay, let's look at just one more. And so for this one, why don't we do, instead of theism, we'll do the hours worked in the past week. And then the other indicator one we did last time was the owning a gun. And so we could see if how many hours people work on average in the last week varies by whether or not people own a gun. And it's already weighted, right? I don't need to return that on. I didn't turn it off. It's still on. I'm still gonna edit this so that I can just look and compare. Okay, so we can see among people who don't own a gun, they worked about 39 hours per week last week on average. People who did own a gun, about 41 and a half. And that's actually substantively different, even though they're pretty close. Think about like the millions of people who do and don't own guns or have guns in their house or garage, I think is what the question asked. And if you take an extra like 2.5 hours and you multiply that by the number of people different, that's a lot of hours. But let's look at these confidence intervals. So this one goes like 37.8 to 39.9. This one goes 40.4 to 42.8. So do they overlap? No, right? The most this one is about 39.9 and the least this is 40.4. So they're significantly different, right? So I'm over 95% confident that people who own a gun versus people who don't, among like all US adults in 2022, would have a different average number or mean number of hours worked last week. And they could be, for how close they might be, I do this 40 minus this 40.42 minus 39.88. And for the furthest away they could be, I do this 42.74 minus this 37.77. Again, you want to picture it on kind of that number line to figure out which are the closest and which are the furthest. Because again, it could be that you are reversing that. This is smaller than that one, and so they're kind of ordered that way already. So is it substantively different? Well, if I compare how close they might be at the 95% confidence level, that would be 0.12 plus, that would be 0.54. So a little bit over half an hour. So again, this is where it's up to you. If you say no, it's only half an hour difference on average, that's okay. I'm going to say yes, because again, these are averages or means. And so again, half an hour, if you multiply that by like 100 million people, let's say, that's a lot of different number of hours of work. And again, they might not be distributed evenly. So that could be a lot more people that are working a lot of hours, right? Like, so there might be a portion that are working a ton more hours, and then most people kind of seem similar. We don't know, but I would say that a half hour here, might be a lot, right? That might be a lot in terms of impact on everything from family to income to other things. And then is it causal? So if I'm arguing that it's significant and substantive, then I need to think about, is there a relationship? So could it be that owning a gun in your home means you work fewer hours? I mean, work more hours. And I'm not sure that I can think of a link between them and why it would vary in that way. I wonder if there's anything about like maybe people are more likely to own a gun in rural areas, which would make it spurious. If I could think of like why people in rural areas maybe have to work more hours. I'm not sure, maybe that, but I can't really think of a good explanation for why I would see this difference. We could look at a different one, like if I put in gender, and we could see there that women, their 95% confidence is between like 37 hours and 38.7 hours, and men it's like 42 to 43.8 hours. And so there we can see that there's a bigger gap, right, between the upper bound and the lower bound here, and that men are working more hours, which we might say, relates to traditional gender ideology and roles in our society, and responsibilities that are allocated around domesticity that require that. Okay. So I think all of the examples we looked at were significant. Let me look at one more. So this is back to theism by that Ungun indicator. And so if I run that, then I end up, oops. It doesn't want me to delete that. That's okay. With right means of people who do own a gun being slightly higher in terms of their theism. But if I look at these confidence intervals, this one goes from 4.48 to 4.72, and this one goes from 4.69 to 5.01. So the furthest apart at the 95% could be from 4.48 to 5.01. So it could be like 0.53. But the closest they could be is the same, right? They could both, for example, be 4.69. That's within this confidence interval and this one, or 4.7 or 4.71 or 4.72. So these two overlap. If you drew them out, they would have overlapping between 4.69 and 4.72. And so that means they're not significantly different. So we're not over 95% confident that the averages are different among gun owners and non-gun owners in terms of their average theistic beliefs. And it also then wouldn't be substantively different. So even if the sample means look substantively different, we're not overly 95% confident that among all US adults, right, rather than just among the folks in this sample, that they're substantively different. And then also we wouldn't argue that it's causal because we're not confident that they're even different. So we're not going to say one's impacting the other if we're not seeing variation in the other.